American democracy is under siege. The world has been watching as events unfold in the United States of America. From the disputed 2020 elections, where President Donald Trump vigorously contested the outcome of the elections, filing lawsuits upon lawsuit, to the endorsement by Congress of Mr. Joe Biden as the incoming president-elect of the United States. And the latest being the invasion of the U.S. Capitol by supporters of Mr. Donald Trump. Yes, Mr. Trump encouraged his supporters to peacefully invade the U.S. Capitol and to go home thereafter. But where the world has watched in awe as the events unfolded, with world leaders condemning the events and some not so much as condemning what happened. These and other issues are what we'll be discussing on this special edition of Indepth. I'm Justin Mahlatla, and I'm joined here by my guest, Bright Shadaya. To give a background to our discussion, let's start with your analysis of the electoral processes of the United States, perhaps even comparing them to our own electoral processes. What would be the major differences and what are the major highlights of that process?
All right, I think the major highlight of the electoral process between the contemporary African system and the American system is the American system is very decentralized. As you've noticed, I'm sure you've heard about the Electoral College. This is America's way to split up the voting process. So every state sort of regulates its own elections and certifies its own elections and then later on sends them through to the House of Congress. So I think that is the primary difference of that decentralization. Whereas here we have one electoral body that oversees all elections in all constituencies. In America, every single state has its own electoral body that oversees their own elections. So like Matabeleland will have its own ZEC, Manicaland will have its own ZEC, and here in Harare will have our own ZEC. That's the primary difference.
Mm-hmm. Now we have this understanding that according to the claims by the United States, even before the elections, President Trump was so confident in that electoral system that it would be very clean and clear. And yet we have him now crying foul that there was a rigging of that election, some votes were manipulated and so forth. What's your take?
My take is, yes, initially Trump was confident, but building up closer to the election in light of the coronavirus and people's hesitancy to actually go to the polls and vote. This election was going to have more mail-in voters. This is where I can vote from home through the mail system. That is now where Trump was a bit hesitant, as he feared that his Republicans were less likely to vote using the mail-in system, and because of the coronavirus, Trump felt that would give him a disadvantage. So that is when Trump began hesitancy. And then now, as you saw rightfully, as the election went on, the initial votes on the 3rd, which were the physical votes, Trump was winning in other states or was very close to Biden in other states. But when the mail-in votes started to be counted, Biden surpassed Trump, and we have his 300-plus electoral college votes.
Some claim that the margins, especially in those key states, Georgia, Wisconsin, and others, the margins between Biden and Trump's votes were indicating that perhaps the elections or the votes were actually biased or they were rigged so that Biden would win. What's your take on that?
Okay, my take on that, according to, let me use president and use the Al Gore and Bush election of 2000. The state that was ordered to go to a recount was Florida, and the margin there was about 500 votes out of 6 million ballots cast. So if you compare the margins that Trump is complaining about, it's in its thousands. So there's actually no precedent to actually recount a vote that has that margin of a gap. But you'll see that in Georgia, the votes were fairly close and they were ordered to a recount. And Trump still lost after 3 recounts in Georgia, and the Electoral College certified Biden as the winner in Georgia.
Now let's look at the time frames from the campaigns, the votes, the voting processes, the announcement of results, even as we draw near to the inauguration of Mr. Biden. Would you say the system has been able to follow the expected time frames?
Yes, in terms of time frames, they're on to date. Yesterday, when they stormed Capitol Hill, that was the 6th. That's when Congress is supposed to certify Electoral College votes under the supervision of Mike Pence, the Vice President. And yes, they've been they've been on time. They've been on time. There hasn't been anything majorly irregular. And like what critics are saying to Trump, if you do feel there's been voter fraud, present your proof and present your evidence. So we can, you know what? We can take it up to court. But courts have since dismissed most of Trump's accusations, considering baseless, and they lack concrete evidence.
Well, what exactly are what does the law, the U.S. electoral law say in terms of discrepancies in an election in this instance?
All right, for the U.S. system, there's actually no set procedure for electoral dispute resolution, but there are ways in which lawyers can follow and the legal team for certain parties can follow. For example, I'll just outline the system and at which point that they can, you know, bring forth their complaints. So we start off having our voting team, the legal votes, the ones who count when we throw our ballots. Then after that, now the party's legal team can then now lodge an appeal, or they can take up their issue to state courts. They don't go straight to the Supreme Court Justice, which is the main court of the US, but they start at state level. Then at state level, they can either uphold the election or they can order a recount. In Georgia, we had a recount, which Biden still won. Yeah. But however, the Supreme Court Justice does have the capacity to overturn the ruling of a lower court or a state Supreme Court, which was done in 2000 on Al Gore and Biden, where the court ordered the recount in Florida to stop. And Bush was declared the winner of the 2000 presidential election.
And now it seems Mr. Trump has been finding it difficult to finally accept that Mr. Biden won, even after the endorsement by Congress and the courts. He has actually asked his supporters to peacefully invade the U.S. Capitol, and after the chaos that ensued, he also asked them to peacefully go home. What can the world learn from the character of Mr. Trump?
I think one thing we need to consider first about Mr. Trump, before he became a president, he was an entertainer. So I feel that is naturally in his, you know, in his personality and his disposition.
You think it was scripted?
Not necessarily scripted, but even if you've noticed a lot of Trump's speeches during his presidency, he'd always talk about TV ratings, about popularity, about being the best. So I think this is an issue of Trump not wanting to concede power or lose the spotlight. And these may just be rants of an egomaniac, or, you know, a baby in a big man's body crying out for attention and not wanting to concede power. So I feel for me, this Capitol Hill storming, it's the perfect climax for a presidency such as Trump. I think this whole presidency has been building up to such an occurrence.
What lessons can the world draw from the U.S. elections, Zimbabwe in particular?
All right, for Zimbabwe and the world in particular, I think this incident actually asks questions of the democratic system, not only of America, but of the world as a whole. There are contemporary authors in Western politics, such as Francis Fukuyama. He wrote a book entitled The End of History and the Last Man. This book asserts that democracy is the cure-all system. It's a political system that solves all contradictions in society. But from what's been happening now with the storming of Capitol Hill and the failure of liberal democracies to deal with the coronavirus outbreak and being beaten by China, less democratic states, and having African states, which they constantly criticize, managing this crisis better than them, it kind of shows that this assertion or this belief by Western countries that democracy is the supreme form of governance and this is the end of history in terms of political development, it sort of comes into question now. So I'm sure a lot of world leaders are going to now start introspecting amongst themselves and start analyzing this democratic system. Does it need refinement, reformment, or to slightly make it better in order to, you know, be able to deal with crisis or curb polarization, such as in the US?
But can we use this particular instance of the elections and the chaos to judge American democracy? All
right, there's a saying that says when a great empire loses a battle or is exposed, it's not because of one mistake or one chance occurrence. It's as a result of years of decay within the system. So when you see a great power such as America being exposed to this extent, it's not just a Trump issue. It shows that the American system has been in decline for a very long time.
Well, what do you say to Zimbabwe?
To Zimbabwe in regards to this?
Yes.
I think in regards to this as Zimbabwe, I think it's an issue of us to emphasize our sovereignty, and it makes us realize that all nations have their own problems at hand. And this gives us impetus now for us to act rightly and do what we are supposed to do for the betterment of our country, and then maybe listen less to foreign interference but find local solutions for our own individual problems, and stop relying on copy-paste doctrines where what you feel works in the West works for us here in Zimbabwe. Our societies are different, our social evolution, political evolution is different, so therefore different or hybrid systems might be required.
Certainly hybrid systems required for a democracy such as Zimbabwe, and as you have said, it's a process that Zimbabwe needs to adapt what is suitable for what it needs, for its needs, and then work on that to improve its own democratic systems. Thank you so much, Bright, for giving us your time.
Welcome. Thank you for having me.
We continue to discuss the events that have rocked the world, taking place in the United States of America. President Donald Trump's refusal to accept the outcome of the 2020 presidential election and his reluctance to do so after the endorsement of Mr. Biden by Congress and the courts, and also the shocking invasion of Capitol Hill by Mr. Trump's supporters. I'm now joined by international relations scholar Xavier Katan. Xavier, we want to analyze what has taken place in the United States. We know that the world is actually in shock with regards to the developments that have taken place, the storming of the U.S. Capitol Hill, and even the refusal by President Trump to accept the results, even begrudgingly so after the endorsement of Mr. Biden by Congress. What is your general analysis of the events that have taken place lately in the U.S.?
The first thing that we should take notice is that we are looking at a very sad development. The storming of Capitol Hill is the second of its kind in American history, right? The first one being in 1814, right, by the British, right? And this occurrence has actually taken the whole world by shock. You know why? It is simply because the Americans have been priding themselves as the hallmark of democracy in the society, right? So, generally speaking, if we were to look at the American democracy, it is being tested right now. It means it has been fragmented altogether. The Americans cannot now stand and say, look, we are the best in democracy. Look, what you are doing is wrong. Look, this is not correct. Right. If I want to take into perspective the U.S. Zimbabwe relations at the moment, right, the relationship is actually very sour. Right. You remember the ironically titled Zimbabwe Democracy and Economic Recovery Act, ZIDERA, right? The issue of democracy is actually one of the pivotal instruments of that document, right? Where the U.S. are alleging that Zimbabwe is not following democracy, simply because during elections, right, there are some kind of skirmishes which are actually okay, right? If we were to go back just to is it August 1, right? Where some opposition supporters in Zimbabwe actually marched into the streets and burnt some buses and so forth, and accidentally some around 7 or so people were shot dead. Right? Those actions were condemned strongly by the Americans, and they were used to renew ZIDERA, the sanctions that were imposed on Zimbabwe. You get the point. But now what we are now saying, if this is what happened to us, can you also now tell us what's happening in your own country? Right. It's actually a shock that this is happening, but we are not shocked as analysts because we know these things have been happening. Right. Only that this is just a tip of the iceberg. Things have been happening, but thanks to Trump, it's now coming to the fore.
4 people actually died in these skirmishes that took place at Capitol Hill. And Mr. Trump himself was the one who rallied his supporters to, in quotes, peacefully invade the Capitol Hill. What does this tell us about the character of Mr. Trump?
Mr. Trump actually said we don't have to be weak. And we are looking at the head of state, in fact, the most powerful state in the world, actually inciting people to actually be violent and demonstrate. And to quote the words used by Biden actually said, these people who actually stormed the Capitol Hill are not protesters, but are actually a riotous gang, a mob. When we use the same wording here in Zimbabwe, in reference to a gang of people who are actually going about the streets disturbing peace and security, we are told that we are actually violating human rights. But when it's happening in America, right, then it's not like that. Right. So we are saying America itself is showing that it is actually a rogue state. It's a vampire state, right? And this is epitomized by the head of state, who is Donald Trump at the moment. What Trump is showing is exactly what America is. Only that the other presidents who may come or who may actually be elected would want to pamper this situation, right, in order not to show the true character of the American state. But Trump has shown this, and we know that one woman was shot by the police right in the Capitol Hill chambers itself, right, and the other three also died in the skirmishes. Some on arrival to hospital, right, and we don't even know how many have died right now. But we don't have any condemnation whatsoever coming from the American state. Even our dear ambassador Nichols, who is actually always at the forefront of commenting on these issues, is actually quiet. It's an embarrassment, a huge embarrassment, right? And now we need to question: is American democracy the real thing? That's a question that we need to ask.
And when you are talking about that question, Xavier, it's an interesting question. Is American democracy the real thing? We have responses that have come in from world leaders across the world. For example, I have here a response from UK Prime Minister Boris Johnson, who says, and I quote, "All my life, America has stood for some very important things, the idea of freedom and an idea of democracy." Now, when we look at what has happened so far, even the refusal by Mr. Trump to accept the results, what does that tell us about democracy from an American perspective?
It's an illusion. It's a fallacy. You get the point? That's an illusion. It's a fallacy. It's not even true and correct, right? What Americans have been trying to do all along is to force other people to try and do their bidding. American democracy is only democracy as long as it's able to protect territorial and economic interests of the American state. As long as that is protected, then that's democracy. If that is not violated, then we don't have a problem. Right? It means the Americans actually talk of democracy in as far as it is only protecting their interests. But when it comes to the real nature of democracy, it doesn't exist in America. And America does not have the moral right to teach us here in Zimbabwe or Africa about democracy, because it has shown that it has failed completely. And we have always known this. This is a issue that we have known for years, right? And another issue also, the International Criminal Court of Justice, right, which came into being through the Rome Statute, right, has never been ratified by the Americans. The Americans have never ratified the Rome Statute, and they are not part and parcel of the International Criminal Court of Justice, a court that has been established to actually punish violators of human rights. But do you know that Americans are the major donors to the ICC? They actually control ICC, an institution which they are not part of. They are protecting interests only, but they don't want to also be accountable for the human rights that they violate day in and day out. In Iraq, in Yemen, in Saudi Arabia, in Afghanistan.
Xavier, you are bringing in an exciting perspective to the whole issue of what has happened in the United States. But in a few days, President Donald Trump, whether he likes it or not, he will be out of the picture, and in comes President Joe Biden. Do you see a change in American foreign policy, in American systems of democracy, the rule of law, etc., with the coming in of Mr. Biden?
American foreign policy will never change. It has never changed in history. It is only some of the methodologies to achieve those interests which change slightly. But over and above everything else, the foreign policy doesn't change. The Americans want to protect their interests, whether by splendid isolation like what Trump has been doing, or whether by just bringing in a lot of allies that do the American bidding. Right. But at the end of the day, the foreign policy doesn't change.
So, Xavier, what lessons can the world learn from America, particularly those countries that have always idolized the United States as an epitome of democracy?
The first thing, Justice, is democracy is not an end in itself. No country can actually say, this is our democracy. This is how democracy is supposed to be. Democracy is actually something that continues to happen. It's something that we should improve on over and above everything else. What we should learn from this is that the Americans are actually part and parcel of this world. They are also struggling to maintain democracy. No country whatsoever is actually managed to achieve what we may call true democracy. True democracy right now doesn't actually exist. Right? We are all fighting to make sure that it's a continuous progression. Right? So all those countries should now realize and know that no country in this world can actually say, we've got this particular issue that we call democracy, and things cannot be measured by American way of defining democracy.
And what can actually be done? What is the way forward with regards the events in the Americans and what has been happening in the world over? What exactly is the way forward? How should countries handle their own politics?
We should condemn in the strongest terms what has actually happened in America, right? That's number one. Number two, we should learn to respect the rule of law. We should learn to respect human rights. But above all, let's try to make sure that we maintain peace and security within our nations and condemn what is bad and actually promote what is right. This idea of simply saying you are doing things wrong simply because we've got interests that we want to protect should end. But I know, Justice, that the West itself, the British, the Germans, the French, and everyone else, they know that the Americans have always been like this. Even they themselves, they also know that they are also like this, right? So they would condemn and say, but in the near future, right, everyone will forget about these things, and life will turn to normal. And Africa, Zimbabwe, and the rest will still face the wrath of the Americans.
Thank you so much, Xavier. Quite an insightful discussion there, and we want to appreciate your views with regards to what has been happening in the United States.
You're welcome, Justin. Thank you, viewers.
And that was Xavier Katanda, an international relations scholar. We were taking a look at the developments in the United States of America, events that have shaken the world. For the second time, the U.S. Capitol Hill has been invaded, and this is an event that has actually attracted the attention of not only the ordinary person in the street, but even the world leaders across the globe. And thank you so much for having joined us on this special edition of In Depth. Have a pleasant viewing.